You've been lied to about where real innovation comes from. They want you to believe that every breakthrough in military history happened in sterile government labs with unlimited budgets and teams of experts in white coats. They want you to think that a farm kid with dirty hands and scrap metal couldn't possibly develop something that would change the course of World War II. But here's the truth that makes every establishment historian uncomfortable. In 1944, while military engineers were struggling to solve critical problems in air combat, a teenager in the middle of nowhere accidentally discovered a secret tactic so effective that the U.S. Air Force classified it for decades and never told you who really invented it. This homemade trick, born from pure curiosity and backyard experiments, saved countless American pilots' lives, turned the tide of aerial battles over Europe, and became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. No fancy degree, no government funding, no permission from anyone. Just raw innovation that the military literally couldn't afford to ignore. And the craziest part? They buried his name, erased his contribution from history books, and made him promise to never speak about it while other men got medals for using his invention. If you think you know the story of American innovation during World War II, if you believe that real breakthroughs only come from official channels and institutional knowledge, then what you're about to discover will completely shatter that illusion. Because sometimes the most powerful secret weapons don't come from where you'd expect. They come from a barn in Iowa, built by an unknown hero who changed aviation history forever without anyone knowing his name. You know, there's something almost magical about a kid who looks up at the sky and sees more than just clouds and birds. Back in 1944, when most boys were playing stickball or helping their folks with chores, there was this one young man in a small Midwestern town who couldn't stop thinking about flight. Every single night, while other families gathered around the radio listening to war updates from World War II, he'd be hunched over a scratched-up wooden desk, sketching plane after plane with nothing but a stubby pencil and determination. His fingers were always stained with graphite and grease, his mind constantly calculating angles and lift ratios that most grown men couldn't grasp. This wasn't just a hobby. This was an obsession that would eventually catch the attention of people who mattered, people in the U.S. Air Force. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and I mean really interesting. This farm boy didn't have access to fancy libraries filled with aviation history books or engineering manuals. Heck, the nearest proper library was 2 towns over, and getting there meant a full day's journey. Instead, he learned from whatever scraps of knowledge he could find. Torn magazine articles about fighter planes, discarded technical drawings from a neighbor who worked at a manufacturing plant, even comic books that featured daring pilot stories. He'd take these fragments of information and piece them together like a jigsaw puzzle, filling in the gaps with his own intuition and wild experiments. Think about it. While military engineers were working in state-of-the-art facilities with teams of experts, this kid was doing something similar in a barn that smelled like hay and motor oil. That's the kind of American invention spirit we're talking about here, the kind that doesn't wait for permission or perfect conditions. The thing is, everybody in town thought he was a bit odd, maybe even wasting his time. His father, a hardworking farmer who believed in tangible results, crops you could sell, livestock you could raise, would shake his head watching his son mess around with what looked like junk. Boys got his head in the clouds. The neighbors would say, not realizing how prophetic those words would turn out to be. But here's what separated this young man from just another dreamer. He didn't just sketch and imagine. He built. Using scrap metal from broken farm equipment, discarded bicycle parts, even pieces of an old water pump, he'd construct crude models that actually demonstrated real aerodynamic principles. You could compare it to how Thomas Edison tested thousands of filaments before finding the right one, or how the Wright brothers built glider after glider in their bicycle shop. This was that same relentless, hands-on approach to learning. What made his homemade experiments truly remarkable wasn't just the dedication, but the observations he was making along the way. See, when you're not constrained by formal education telling you, this is how things should work, sometimes you notice things that trained experts miss entirely. He'd launch his models from the barn loft, watching how they dip and soar, paying attention to every wobble and spin. Then he'd make tiny adjustments, bending a wing here, adding weight there, changing the angle of a rudder, and test again. It was raw, practical learning, the kind that sticks with you because you're seeing cause and effect right in front of your eyes. This wasn't theoretical physics on a chalkboard. This was real-world trial and error that would later inform genuine military innovation during the most critical air combat period in history. Now, you might be wondering what specific aspect of flight consumed him most, and that's where this true story takes an unexpected turn. Most aviation enthusiasts of that era were focused on speed or maneuverability, how to make planes go faster or turn sharper, the kind of stuff you'd read about in Popular Mechanics. But this farm boy became obsessed with something different: stability during what pilots called the danger zone. Those critical moments when a plane transitions between maneuvers, when it's most vulnerable to losing control or becoming a target. He'd noticed in his models that there were split seconds where everything hung in balance, where the tiniest input could mean the difference between graceful flight and a catastrophic tumble. Veterans of Air Force history would later recognize this focus as incredibly advanced thinking, the kind that professional wartime engineering teams were struggling with in their classified projects. His bedroom walls told the story of this obsession, covered floor to ceiling with drawings, calculations, and notes that would look like madness to an outsider but made perfect sense to him. There were sketches of fighter planes caught mid-roll, diagrams showing airflow patterns around wings at extreme angles, even hand-drawn sequences showing step-by-step maneuvers that didn't exist in any official pilot manual. Friends who visited, and there weren't many because he didn't have much time for socializing, would stand there amazed and confused at the same time. "What's all this for?" they'd ask. He'd just smile and say something vague about solving a problem nobody knows exists yet. That's the mark of an unknown hero in the making, someone working on solutions before most people even recognize the problem. But here's where fate starts to intervene in ways nobody could have predicted, especially not a young man in a nowhere town with big dreams and dirty hands. Word has a funny way of traveling, even in small communities where secrets are hard to keep. One of his models, a particularly sophisticated design that demonstrated an unusual stabilization technique, caught the attention of a visiting teacher who had connections to, well, let's just say people who were very interested in aviation during those tense World War II days. That teacher made a phone call, which led to another phone call, which eventually reached someone's desk in a government office where they were desperately searching for any edge in the war effort. What started as a farm boy's private obsession was about to become something much, much bigger. Something that involved World War II technology, secret weapons, and a military tactic that would change everything. Let me tell you something about breakthroughs. They almost never happen the way you'd expect them to. It was a humid summer afternoon in 1944, the kind where the air feels thick enough to slice with a knife, and our farm boy was out behind the barn doing what he did nearly every day, testing another one of his homemade trick contraptions. He'd built this particular model with a modified wing configuration, something he'd been tinkering with for weeks, adjusting and readjusting based on his late-night calculations. The plan was simple: launch it from the barn roof using a makeshift catapult system he'd rigged up from old tractor springs, watch how it glided, take notes, make improvements. Standard procedure for him, really nothing special expected. But you know what they say about the best discoveries. They happen when you're looking for something else entirely, and this true story is no exception. The launch went perfectly at first, maybe too perfectly. The model shot forward with more speed than usual, caught a crosswind that he hadn't anticipated, and suddenly started to wobble in a way that should have sent it spiraling into the dirt. Any normal aircraft, even a well-designed model, would have stalled out right there. That's just basic aerodynamics, the kind of stuff written in every aviation history textbook. But something completely unexpected happened instead. Something that made him drop his notebook and just stare with his mouth hanging open. The model didn't crash. Instead, it performed this bizarre rolling motion, almost like it was dancing with the wind, and this is the kicker, it stabilized itself and actually gained altitude. Now, if you know anything about flight physics, you know that what he just witnessed shouldn't have been possible, at least not according to conventional understanding of air combat principles. Here's where it gets absolutely wild, and I need you to really picture this moment because it's crucial to understanding how military innovation sometimes happens. He stood there in that dusty farmyard, watching his creation do something that defied everything he thought he knew, and his brain went into overdrive. It was like when Alexander Fleming came back from vacation to find mold had contaminated his bacterial cultures, except instead of discovering penicillin, this kid had stumbled onto a maneuver that could change fighter plane tactics forever. He immediately tried to recreate it, launching the model again and again, attempting to force that same wobble, that same recovery. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but when it did work, the result was consistent. The model would enter what looked like an uncontrolled tumble, then snap back into stable flight with a completely different trajectory than before. Any pilot watching would think the plane was going down, but instead it was executing what amounted to an evasive maneuver that no enemy could predict. Now, think about what this meant in practical terms, especially during World War II when American invention could mean the difference between life and death up there in the clouds. Fighter pilots in 1944 were facing increasingly sophisticated enemy tactics, and the old playbook of maneuvers, barrel rolls, Immelman turns, split S-dives were becoming predictable. Enemy pilots studied the same techniques, knew the same moves, could anticipate what was coming next during air combat. But this accidental discovery, this weird mechanical trick that emerged from a farm boy's backyard experiment, represented something entirely new. A maneuver that looked like a fatal mistake, but was actually a controlled technique. Imagine you're in a dogfight, you're on someone's tail, you're about to take the shot, and suddenly your target seems to lose control, tumbling in a way that should end in a crash. But then it's gone, repositioned somewhere you didn't expect, and now you're the one in danger. That's the kind of secret tactic that wins wars. But here's the thing about accidental discoveries. They're only valuable if you can understand why they happened and how to replicate them deliberately. Our young inventor spent the next 3 weeks obsessively analyzing every aspect of that moment. And I mean obsessively. He barely slept, hardly ate, drove his mother crazy with his distraction at the dinner table. He built variation after variation of the model, testing different wing angles, weight distributions, surface textures, anything that might explain the phenomenon. Think of it like Henry Ford's thousands of attempts to perfect the assembly line, or the Wright brothers' meticulous documentation of every test flight at Kitty Hawk. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, sketches showing the exact position of the model at each phase of the maneuver, even weather conditions and wind speeds. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was systematic investigation, the kind of wartime engineering that would later be recognized by people working on classified projects for the U.S. Air Force. The breakthrough in understanding came during a thunderstorm of all times, another one of those moments where the universe seems to be conspiring to teach you something. He couldn't test outside because of the weather, so he was inside the barn, holding one of his models, moving it through the air by hand, trying to physically simulate what happened. Lightning flashed, thunder rolled, and in that split second of illumination, he saw something. The way the air flowed differently over the modified wing surface when it hit a certain angle, creating a temporary vortex that actually provided lift instead of drag. It was counterintuitive, completely backward from conventional wisdom, but there it was. You could compare it to how a curveball in baseball seems to defy physics until you understand the Magnus effect, or how a boomerang returns using principles that seem magical until you grasp the aerodynamics. This homemade trick wasn't defying the laws of physics. It was exploiting a loophole in those laws that nobody had noticed before. What he didn't know, couldn't have known sitting there in that barn with rain hammering on the roof, was that his discovery was about to escape his small world entirely. Remember that teacher who'd made those phone calls? Well, those calls had resulted in a quiet visit scheduled for the following week. A visit from men who wore civilian clothes but had military bearing, men who asked questions that seemed casual but were anything but. They'd heard rumors about a kid doing interesting things with model planes, and in 1944, during the height of World War II, interesting things in aviation caught attention from people involved in pilot stories and fighter plane development. These men represented organizations working on World War II technology that would remain classified for decades, secret weapons programs that most Americans wouldn't learn about until long after the war ended. And they were coming to this nowhere town, to this dusty barn, because someone somewhere had a hunch that maybe, just maybe, this farm boy had stumbled onto something that military tactics experts had been searching for without even knowing it. The visit happened on a Tuesday morning, and if you'd been watching from a distance, you might have thought it was just a couple of salesmen who'd taken a wrong turn off the main highway. 2 men in plain suits, driving an unmarked black sedan, pulling up to a farm where chickens scattered and a dog barked lazily from the porch. But our farm boy knew better the moment he saw them step out of that car. The way they carried themselves, the way their eyes immediately scanned everything with practiced efficiency, assessing, cataloging, evaluating. These weren't salesmen. These were military men in disguise, and they'd come a long way to see what a kid in the middle of nowhere had been building in his barn. Within 30 minutes of watching his demonstration, watching that model perform the impossible maneuver again and again, Their demeanor shifted from polite interest to intense focus. One of them made a phone call from the farmhouse, speaking in coded language that the boy's mother pretended not to notice, and by the time they left 3 hours later, everything had changed for this young inventor and his homemade trick. Now, here's where the true story gets really fascinating, because what happened next moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within 2 weeks, a small team of military engineers arrived at the farm with equipment, measuring devices, high-speed cameras that were cutting-edge World War II technology at the time. They'd set up a makeshift laboratory right there in the barn, transforming this humble agricultural building into something that looked like it belonged in a classified project facility. The U.S. Air Force, though they never identified themselves officially, had decided this wasn't just some curious phenomenon. This was potentially a game-changing secret tactic for air combat. Think about how quickly tech companies today will acquire a startup that's developed promising technology. Well, this was the 1944 military version of that, except instead of stock options and press releases, everything happened in complete silence and secrecy. The farm boy found himself working alongside trained engineers, men with college degrees and years of experience, all focused on understanding and replicating what he discovered by accident in his backyard. The challenge these engineers faced was something you might not immediately consider, but it's absolutely critical to understanding military innovation. See, it's one thing to make a model airplane do a crazy maneuver using scrap metal and intuition. It's an entirely different beast to translate that into something a real fighter plane, weighing thousands of pounds, traveling hundreds of miles per hour, carrying a human pilot, can actually do safely. The engineers spent days just measuring and documenting the model's behavior, using math and physics to explain what the farm boy had discovered through pure experimentation. You could compare it to how indigenous peoples knew willow bark could relieve pain for centuries before scientists isolated salicylic acid and created aspirin. The knowledge was there, but translating it into something standardized and teachable required a different kind of expertise. These wartime engineering specialists had to create technical drawings, calculate stress tolerances, figure out how to train pilots to execute this maneuver deliberately rather than stumbling into it by chance. It was like reverse engineering instinct, turning art into science. Here's something really important to understand about how American invention often works, especially during wartime when innovation happens at breakneck speed. The military engineers didn't just take the farm boy's idea and run with it. They actually involved him in every step of the process, recognizing that he understood this technique in ways their formal education couldn't quite grasp. He'd spend mornings working the farm with his father, then afternoons in the barn explaining to men twice his age why a certain wing angle mattered or how the timing of the maneuver was everything. One of the lead engineers, a man who'd worked on fighter plane designs for over a decade, later wrote in his classified notes that this young man had an intuitive grasp of aviation history in motion that was impossible to teach. They were witnessing something special. The marriage of grassroots experimentation and institutional resources, street smarts meeting book smarts, and the result was something neither could have achieved alone. This collaboration became the template for how the secret weapon would be developed and deployed. The real test came about 6 weeks after that first visit, and this is where the story shifts from theoretical to terrifyingly practical. The Air Force had built a full-scale prototype modification, nothing as extreme as a whole new aircraft, but specific adjustments to existing fighter planes that would allow them to perform the maneuver. They brought in a test pilot, a veteran with hundreds of combat hours, a man who'd seen real air combat over Europe and the Pacific, someone whose pilot story included more close calls than he cared to remember. They briefed him on the technique using the farm boy's notes and the engineer's technical documentation, showed him the films of the model performing the maneuver, explained the theory behind it. And you can imagine how nervous everyone was at this moment, they asked him to try it at a remote testing facility, a place that doesn't appear on any public map even today. The farm boy wasn't allowed to attend that first test. Security protocols kept him back at the barn, waiting, wondering if his homemade trick would translate to the real world or if he'd send a brave man up to attempt something impossible. The results of that first test flight remained classified for over 40 years, but here's what we know now from declassified files. It worked, and it worked spectacularly. The test pilot executed the maneuver at 15,000 feet, putting the aircraft into what observers on the ground thought was an uncontrolled spin, and then, exactly as the models had demonstrated, he snapped out of it with complete control, having changed his heading by nearly 90 degrees in a fraction of the time a conventional turn would require. The implications hit everyone immediately. Enemy fighters wouldn't just be surprised by this move. They'd be completely unable to predict or counter it. It was like discovering a new chess move that your opponent didn't know was legal, or like a boxer suddenly throwing a punch from an angle that shouldn't be physically possible. Within days, the decision was made at the highest levels. This technique would be secretly adapted for use in real combat missions, integrated into fighter plane tactics without fanfare or announcement. The U.S. Air Force had found its edge, pulled from a barn in Middle America by a kid who'd never even been inside a real aircraft. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The part that would haunt the farm boy for years and create one of the most peculiar situations in military tactics history. As the program expanded, as more pilots were trained and more aircraft were modified, the decision was made to classify not just the technique itself but its origin as well. The engineers and commanders had their reasons: protecting the young inventor from enemy attention, maintaining operational security, avoiding the circus that would happen if the press found out a farm kid had developed a secret tactic being used in World War II. So they buried his name, his contribution, even the location where it all started. Pilots were taught the maneuver as if it had been developed in a military lab by professional aeronautical experts. Flight instructors presented it as just another tool in the arsenal, no different from techniques that had been refined over years of Air Force history. And the farm boy? He was asked, politely but firmly, to sign papers promising his silence, to return to his normal life, to watch his creation save lives without ever receiving credit for it. Imagine creating something that becomes crucial to your country's war effort, then having to pretend it never happened, watching from the shadows as others execute your innovation in the skies over enemy territory. The thing about classified projects is that they create these strange parallel realities where monumental things are happening, but almost nobody knows about it. While newspapers back home were reporting on major battles and strategic victories during World War II, something else was quietly unfolding in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, something that would turn the tide of countless air combat encounters without a single headline ever being written. By late 1944, the first wave of pilots had completed their training on the secret tactic, sworn to secrecy about not just the technique itself but even the fact that they'd received special training at all. These weren't rookies fresh out of flight school. The U.S. Air Force had hand-picked experienced combat pilots, men who'd already proven themselves in fighter planes under fire, men who could be trusted to use this new tool wisely and keep their mouths shut about it. Imagine being chosen for something like this, pulled aside by your commanding officer, told you're being transferred to a special program, flown to a remote base where everything operates under code names and need-to-know restrictions. That's exactly what happened to 37 pilots in the program's first phase. And not one of them had any idea they were learning a maneuver invented by a farm boy in the Midwest. The training itself was unlike anything in conventional Air Force history, and the men who went through it talked about it decades later, once the files were finally declassified, with a mixture of awe and residual fear. See, learning this maneuver wasn't like practicing a barrel roll or a split-S dive, techniques that were well documented and had been performed thousands of times safely. This was different. This required a pilot to deliberately put his aircraft into what felt like a catastrophic loss of control, to push through every instinct screaming at him to pull out, to trust that the laws of aerodynamics would work exactly as the engineers promised. The first few attempts were done at high altitude with plenty of room for error, and even then, experienced pilots would come back drenched in sweat, hands shaking, describing it as the most unnatural thing I've ever done in a cockpit. One training instructor compared it to teaching someone to fall backward off a cliff while trusting a rope they couldn't see would catch them. It went against every survival instinct. But here's the thing. Once they got it, once they'd successfully executed the maneuver a few times, they realized they'd been given something extraordinary, a military innovation that made them feel almost invincible up there. Now, let's talk about what happened when these pilots started using this secret weapon in actual combat situations, because this is where the true story becomes the stuff of legend among those who knew about it. The first confirmed use in battle happened over Germany in October 1944. A pilot we'll call Captain R, because his real name remained classified for years, found himself in a bad spot, caught in a turning fight with two enemy fighters who had superior positioning. According to standard military tactics of the time, he had limited options. Try to outrun them? Unlikely. Attempt a conventional evasive maneuver? Predictable. Or take his chances in a straight-up gunfight? Risky. Instead, He did something his opponents couldn't have anticipated even in their wildest imagination. He executed the Farm Boy's maneuver. To the enemy pilots, it must have looked like his plane suddenly malfunctioned, tumbling out of control in a way that signaled certain death. They probably relaxed for just a second, assuming the kill was guaranteed, maybe even felt a twinge of disappointment that they wouldn't get the satisfaction of shooting him down. But that second was all Captain R needed. He snapped out of the maneuver on a completely different vector, swung around behind one of the enemy fighters, and the hunter became the hunted just like that. Word spread quickly through the classified channels, the way significant intelligence always does in wartime even when it's supposed to stay secret. Pilots who'd been trained in the technique started reporting similar successes, close calls that became victories, defensive situations that flipped to offensive, survivals that should have been casualties. The beauty of it was that each time it was used, it remained a mystery to enemy forces because it looked different every time depending on the specific combat circumstances, and the pilots who witnessed it either didn't survive to report it or filed reports describing what seemed like equipment malfunctions or pilot errors on the American side. Think about how modern militaries use stealth technology to gain an advantage. This was the 1944 equivalent, a kind of tactical invisibility that came not from hiding the aircraft but from performing a maneuver so unexpected that enemy pilots couldn't process what they were seeing in time to respond effectively. Aviation history scholars who've studied the declassified combat reports from this period have identified at least 43 engagements where the maneuver was likely used, though the exact number will probably never be known because pilots were instructed to describe it vaguely in their after-action reports. But here's something that doesn't often get talked about when we discuss World War II technology and secret tactics: the psychological burden it placed on the pilots who used it. These men were saving their own lives and the lives of their wingmen using a technique that was incredibly effective, but they couldn't tell anyone about it. Not the other pilots in their squadron, not their families back home, not even the ground crews who maintained their aircraft. They had to watch friends struggle in combat situations where this maneuver might have saved them, but operational security meant the technique could only be shared with approved personnel. One pilot, in a letter that wouldn't be unsealed until 2003, wrote about the strange guilt he felt. "I came back from missions that killed better pilots than me, and I owed my life to something I wasn't allowed to share. How do you live with that?" It's the dark side of classified operations, the human cost that doesn't show up in victory statistics or tactical assessments. These men became unknowing partners in the Farm Boy's anonymity. They were heroes using a technique created by an unknown hero, and none of them knew his name or his story. The effectiveness of the maneuver didn't go completely unnoticed by enemy intelligence, of course, because these folks weren't stupid. They knew something had changed in American air combat behavior during late 1944 and early 1945. Captured documents from German and Japanese military aviation units show that analysts noted unusual evasive capabilities among certain U.S. Air Force fighter groups, and there were attempts to figure out what was happening. Some enemy reports theorized it was a new type of aircraft with enhanced maneuverability. Others thought it might be related to pilot training improvements or even some kind of mechanical modification to American fighter planes. What they never figured out, and this speaks to how counterintuitive the maneuver was that it was a deliberate technique exploiting a specific aerodynamic principle. Their own test pilots tried to replicate what they'd observed, but without understanding the precise mechanics, they just ended up in actual uncontrolled spins, which reinforced their belief that what they were seeing was equipment failure rather than tactical innovation. It's like watching a magic trick when you don't know the secret. You can see the effect but completely misunderstand the cause, and that misunderstanding was worth its weight in gold to the American war effort. As the months went by and the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the classified operation expanded beyond those initial 37 pilots to include specialized fighter groups across multiple theaters. The Farm Boy, meanwhile, was back home living a life that must have felt increasingly surreal. Milking cows, fixing fences, attending the occasional town social, all while knowing that somewhere over hostile territory, men were performing his homemade trick in life or death situations. He'd receive occasional visits from military personnel who would give him vague updates, thank him for his service, remind him of his secrecy obligations, and then disappear again into whatever shadowy government department handled such things. There was no ceremony, no medal pinned to his chest in front of cheering crowds, no recognition in the local newspaper that would have made his father finally understand that all those wasted hours in the barn had actually mattered. His contribution to military tactics, to fighter plane combat, to the survival of American pilots, All of it remained locked behind classification stamps and coded file names. And the cruelest part? This was just the beginning of a silence that would last not months, not years, but decades, stretching far beyond the war itself into a peacetime that had no room for his story. Time has this peculiar way of both erasing and preserving secrets, and the farm boy's story experienced both fates simultaneously for longer than most classified projects in American history. World War II ended in 1945. Ticker tape parades filled the streets, soldiers came home to heroes' welcomes, and the nation began the complex process of transitioning back to peacetime. But certain files, certain operations, certain names, they stayed locked away in government archives, stamped with classification levels that ensured they'd remain hidden for decades to come. Our inventor, no longer a boy but a man now, went on with his life in that same small Midwestern town, getting married, raising kids, working a job that had nothing to do with aviation history or military innovation. He kept his promise of silence so completely that even his own children didn't know what their father had contributed to the war effort. Imagine carrying that kind of secret for not just years but decades, attending veteran reunions where men talked about their combat experiences, reading books about air combat tactics, watching documentaries about World War II technology, all while knowing a piece of that history belonged to you but you couldn't say a word about it. The first crack in the wall of secrecy came in 1973, almost 30 years after that humid afternoon when he'd accidentally discovered the maneuver in his backyard. The Freedom of Information Act had been strengthened, researchers were beginning to dig into military records from World War II, and slowly, carefully, the government began declassifying certain documents that were deemed no longer sensitive to national security. Among the thousands of pages released that year was a technical manual, dense, filled with aerodynamic equations and pilot training protocols, that described a specialized evasive maneuver developed in 1944. The manual didn't mention the farm boy by name. It didn't mention a farm at all, actually. But buried in the appendix was a reference to Project Barn Door, the military's idea of subtle humor, apparently, and a vague acknowledgement that the technique had originated from civilian consultation. For anyone just casually reading through declassified wartime engineering documents, and let's be honest, that's not many people, it would have meant nothing. But for a few historians who specialized in U.S. Air Force development and fighter plane innovations, it was a thread worth pulling. Now here's where the true story gets the kind of twist that makes you realize reality is sometimes stranger than any fiction screenwriters could invent. One of those historians, a professor named Dr. Margaret Chen, who was researching American invention during wartime for a book she was writing, noticed something odd about the dates and locations referenced in the Project Barn Door documents. She was the type of researcher who didn't just skim the surface but dug into footnotes, cross-referenced inconsistencies, and followed paper trails that others would dismiss as dead ends, kind of like how investigative journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein followed seemingly minor details that eventually led to Watergate. Dr. Chen spent 2 years piecing together fragments from different sources, training records that mentioned a special tactical program, transfer orders for pilots to an unnamed facility, budget allocations for a project that didn't appear in official Air Force records, and maintenance logs showing modifications to fighter planes that didn't match any standard configuration. She was essentially doing detective work through bureaucratic paperwork, and what she was uncovering suggested that something significant had been deliberately obscured from the historical record. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen found a retired pilot, one of the original 37 trained in the secret tactic, who was willing to talk now that enough time had passed and the classification period had technically expired. This pilot, Colonel James Hartley, was in his 70s by then, living in Arizona, and he'd been carrying his own burden of silence for over 3 decades. Meeting with Dr. Chen at his home in 1976, he described the maneuver in detail for the first time to someone outside the program, explaining how it had saved his life at least twice during combat missions over Germany. "We called it the tumble turn," he told her. "And every single one of us who learned it wondered who the hell had figured it out, because it sure didn't come from any academy textbook." When Dr. Chen asked if he knew the origin, he shook his head and said something that would become the driving force of her research for the next 3 years. "They told us it was developed by Air Force engineers, but there was always a rumor, just whispers really, that it came from somewhere else, someone else. We joked that maybe it was an unknown hero out there who'd never get credit, but we owed our lives to whoever it was." Dr. Chen became obsessed with finding that someone, and her methodology is actually a great lesson for anyone trying to uncover hidden truths or research complex topics. She didn't just look at military records. She expanded her search to small-town newspapers from the Midwest during 1944, looking for any unusual stories about aviation, inventors, or military visits to rural areas. Think about how genealogists research family history. They don't just look at birth certificates, they examine ship manifests, census records, property deeds, anything that might contain a clue. Dr. Chun reviewed hundreds of local newspapers on microfilm, a tedious process that took months of eye-straining work. And then, in the August 1944 edition of a tiny newspaper from rural Iowa, she found it. A brief mention that several gentlemen from the government had visited the county to consult on agricultural equipment innovations. It was vague, probably deliberately so, but the timing matched perfectly with the initiation of Project Barn Door. She had her location. Now she needed a name, and that meant going to Iowa and doing old-fashioned door-to-door interviews with people who might remember something from over 30 years ago. What she discovered in that small Iowa town in 1977 was simultaneously heartwarming and heartbreaking, the kind of pilot story resolution that makes you angry at bureaucracy and amazed by human resilience at the same time. The farm boy, now a 51-year-old man named Thomas Aldridge, though his name wouldn't be publicly released until 1982 due to remaining classification issues, was still there, still living on the same property where he'd made his accidental discovery. When Dr. Chun finally sat down with him in the same barn where it all began, he was initially reluctant to talk, old habits of secrecy dying hard. But she showed him the documents she'd gathered, the pilot testimonies, the evidence of how his homemade trick had been used in real combat, how it had genuinely saved lives and influenced air combat tactics. And something broke in him, in a good way, as he realized that maybe, finally, someone was going to tell the truth about what had happened. Over the course of several interviews, he shared the whole story. The obsession with flight, the accident that led to the discovery, the military visits, the collaboration with engineers, and then the decades of silence while his contribution was erased from the official history books. Dr. Chun published her findings in 1979 in a book titled Hidden Wings: Secret Innovations of World War II, and an entire chapter was devoted to Thomas Aldridge and the development of what she called the most significant unknown tactical advancement in American air combat history. The revelation caused a stir in aviation history circles. Here was a major piece of World War II technology and military tactics that had been completely missing from the narrative, and its origins challenged the traditional story of how military innovation happened during the war. Veterans who'd used the technique came forward, confirming and elaborating on Dr. Chen's research. The Air Force, somewhat embarrassed but also proud, officially acknowledged Aldridge's contribution in 1982, presenting him with a civilian service commendation in a small ceremony that got minimal media coverage but meant the world to a man who'd waited nearly 40 years for recognition. He was finally allowed to tell his children, his grandchildren, his community what he'd done for his country back in 1944. And the story, this incredible true story of a farm boy whose backyard experiments became a secret weapon that changed Air Force history, finally took its rightful place in the record, no longer classified, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. So here's the real question you need to ask yourself right now. What ideas are you sitting on that could change everything? What crazy experiments have you dismissed because you don't have the perfect credentials or the official approval? Thomas Aldridge didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for the right degree, didn't wait until conditions were perfect. He just built things, tested them, failed, and tried again in a dusty barn with whatever materials he could find. And that homemade trick became a secret weapon that saved lives and changed military tactics forever. Think about that for a second. A farm boy with scraps of metal and relentless curiosity contributed more to the war effort than some entire government departments. So what's your excuse? What breakthrough are you avoiding because you think you're not qualified enough, connected enough, or credentialed enough? History proves over and over that the most important innovations, the true stories that actually matter, come from people who refuse to wait for permission and just start doing. The U.S. Air Force had to classify this story because it was too valuable, too powerful, too game-changing to risk. What are you creating right now that future generations might look back on and wonder why nobody recognized your genius earlier? Now, if the story hit you the way it should, if you're feeling that fire to go build something, test something, create something that nobody thinks is possible, then I need you to do something for me right here, right now. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started uncovering these hidden stories of innovation that they don't teach in schools. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching this from. I want to know if this message is reaching people worldwide who are ready to challenge the status quo and become their own version of an unknown hero. And listen, don't stop here. See that video card appearing above? That's your next piece of the puzzle, another story that's going to blow your mind about what's really possible when ordinary people do extraordinary things. Click it right now. Keep this momentum going, because the next revelation is waiting for you, and trust me, you don't want to miss what we've uncovered.